What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Beck Check Podcast. On today's episode, I interview Dr. Shannon Guerrero. She is a professor of mathematics education at Northern Arizona University. I have taken 2 of her classes, and today we discuss the role of technology and how we can use it in our teaching practice. Technology is such a rich and nuanced topic in education, which makes it a worthy conversation to have. Among many things, we discuss the role of AI in education, which is quickly becoming something we must deal with as educators. I continue to learn a lot from Dr. Guerrero, and I know you will too. Let's jump in. Thanks for agreeing to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I think it's fun. If you want to go ahead and just kind of introduce yourself a little bit, kind of share who you are, what you do, how you got to what you're doing now.
Okay. My name is Shannon Guerrero, and I'm a professor of mathematics education at Northern Arizona University. I started here in 2006. I got my undergrad as I was a math major in undergrad. My dad was a middle school history teacher. And not that there was anything bad that I saw, but I was like, I'm not going to be a teacher. That's just not my thing. I'm going to go do something more important or more, I don't know. And I worked for a year with my math degree, and I hated business world. It was awful. And so I actually went back to Oregon State and got my master's in a credential. And I remember at undergrad and in my master's asking my professors about a PhD and kind of like, what is that? How do you do that? Where do you get it? And at Oregon State, my advisor told me you need 3 years of teaching experience if you're going to get a PhD in math ed, at least. So you have a little bit of street cred. And so I went and taught for 3 years, and then I went to UC Davis, and got my PhD in math ed. And then when I graduated there, NAU is where I ended up. Yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up here. I find it interesting. I think I'm lucky that I kind of stumbled into this is where I'm supposed to be and what I'm supposed to do. I love my job. I love thinking about teaching math. I love working with pre-service and in-service teachers and students. And so this kind of lets me do a little bit of everything.
Gotcha. Do you have a specific focus for any of your research that you've done?
I'm kind of all over the board, but if you look at my research interests in general, I'd say technology is a big one of the areas that I like looking at. More looking at in-service teachers and kind of how you can help teachers grow their practice, and maybe the things that stand in the way of systemic or even internal things that stand in the way of teachers growing their practice. And kind of breaking down that they call it the apprenticeship of observation. We were all students, and in math, that means we were probably products of pretty traditional classrooms. And so it's really hard to break that down and help teachers embrace and know how to implement more student-centered instructional approaches when all you've ever known is a traditional approach. And then our system is just so structured to kind of resist change and resist student-centeredness and the time that it takes to be, the time it takes to do inquiry. It's a lot more efficient and faster to do lecture and worksheets. And so the system's just not set up to support that. So how do you help teachers work within those confines to be more student-centered? So that's kind of like teacher change, teacher development, technology, and then I think, emerging for a lot of researchers in math, that is kind of how equity plays a role in all of that as well.
Absolutely. I love what you just talked about with culture and just that is one of the biggest ideas that stood out from your the first class that I took from you, the reflections in math ed, and we read the teaching gap and did all of that. And that was probably the biggest thing that I took, is just how hard it is to change the culture, because as teachers, at one point we were students and we were immersed in that. And then what does society say about it? And then what is your experience as a student is how it's going to translate to your teaching. And then now, most recently, taking your technology class, I just found it so fascinating. Right off the bat, I'll be honest, I didn't think it was going to be as interesting as it was. I thought, technology, it's whatever. It's just a tool we can use. I kind of know about Desmos. Like, I get it. But what really caught my attention off the bat was when we did the debate about technology. And so just getting to go into the research, just kind of getting to see some of the popular level stuff of people who are really into using math in education. I mean, I'm sorry, not using math, using technology in math education. And so the question that you posed to us was, does it subvert or does it promote learning. I guess, what is your take on this, and how can we think through this topic?
Yeah, and you'll notice we're doing that in the class that you're currently enrolled into with assessment, right? So
Yes.
I like to take, like you said, oh, it's technology. Okay, great. We use technology in math. Let's move on. But
Right.
there's a whole lot more to the issue, and it's not inherently good or bad. And I think that was the whole point of the technology class is, and even with assessments, right? We're looking at standardized testing. I think all of these issues, there's reasons they emerge as common practice, and there's a reason that they become popular or fall off the radar or whatever it might be. And so I don't think anything that we do is inherently good or bad. It ultimately comes down to how we use it or what we do with it. And so, I think it's great for teachers like in that technology class to really think about, like, there are some negative impacts of technology. There's some really strongly positive impacts, but none of them is the tool itself. The calculator itself does not inhibit learning or promote learning. It really comes down to how you use it, right? And so there's so much gut reaction, I think emotional responses, especially like in elementary grades, like, oh, calculators are bad. Well, not necessarily, because you could give an elementary student a calculator and have them work on patterns of twos and skip counting by using just a calculator and observing what they notice of what happens every time you add a two, and how eventually you start getting 24680, 24680, and so yeah, that's a different use than, oh, add 2 plus 2 5 times, tell me what answer you get, right? And so and then high school, of course, we do a lot richer stuff with Desmos and graphing. And so for me, it really comes down to, and even manipulatives. There's nothing that is inherently good or bad, and these things don't have value in and of themselves. It comes down to how you use it. And so that was the whole point of the debate. And I think as educators, as math teachers, you might find resistance, or you might find people asking you to justify why you're doing what you're doing. And so to understand, like, there are some arguments against technology. And so how do I address those in a meaningful way, by knowing both sides of the argument? So, things like that debate that we did is, I think that you should understand both sides, so that when you find your own position, and that's even it too, like, my job is not to tell you technology is good, use it. My job is to say, here's the sides, here's some resources, here's some ways that we could think about our teaching with technology. Now you decide how to adopt that to your own practice. Because, and this is another one of my big soapboxes, is teachers are professionals. You're trained. I think you get so micromanaged in so many ways. And so I'm not here to tell you, do this in your classroom. I'm here to say, here's some choices that you could make. Here's some information you should know. And then here's how you could do this with meaning if you choose to adopt it.
Absolutely. What would you say are some of the most common objections you might hear? So if you start to get into this debate, you start to think through it, what do you think some of the most common objections teachers might hear if they were more pro technology, and how would you respond to some of those?
I think I alluded to it, but definitely in the elementary grades, that it replaces basic facts. And this was an argument that was made about Common Core standards when they came out, in 2010, that we're not looking to replace basic facts, but balance procedural competency with conceptual understanding. And so when people say that, technology inhibits students' learning or replaces how they learn basic facts, it again comes down to how you use it. Are you using it for them to create visuals, or to do investigations, or to look at patterns, or are you using it just as an answer finding tool? And I think in high school, I don't think you find as much resistance, but I think what's interesting in high school is this notion that, are there things that we shouldn't be teaching anymore because the calculator can do it? Do we still need to be doing, I don't know, factoring polynomials, or should we looking more at meaningful applications of polynomials in the real world and let the technology do the number crunching for us? And so I think that's where the debate gets a little bit more nuanced in upper grades, is how much we need to shift what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. And kind of the AI connection too, right? There's just so much technology. There's so much out there that can do everything for us. And so we don't want it to replace our own problem solving and critical thinking. Like, I think you need to have some fundamental understanding of the underpinnings of some of the mathematics that we teach. But to spend weeks and weeks on procedures when that can be done for us, maybe we should be turning more towards application. And and interpretation. And I think that's kind of, when you look at the business world and what they want graduates to have, it's really more of the interpretation of what an output from AI gives you, rather than sitting down and doing it yourself. You know, AI can write computer code. It's not always right, but it gives you a place to start, and then you can go fix it and adjust it to do what you want, but you don't have to start from ground zero anymore. So why are we still starting from ground zero? And it is a huge
Mm-hmm.
philosophical debate about what it means to know and what knowledge is anymore, if computers are generating it.
Right. I know. I definitely go back and forth on this all the time, especially when it comes to, so I teach Algebra 1, and a big focus of our second unit is solving equations, two-step, three-step, multi-step equations using distributive property, solving equations that have fractions and whatnot. And part of me is like, well, I could just type this into Desmos, or I could type this into, a Symbol lab online, or Wolfram Alpha,
Take a
or
picture.
take a picture, right? Photo math, right? That was one of the
Yeah.
great things from our, I don't know if that was part of the debate assignment, but it was part of one of the assignments in technology where
Yeah.
we talked about photo math. And it's like, well, is photo math the problem? Or are we just not asking rich enough questions where they
Yeah.
need to use the technology in a way to help them make applications that the tech couldn't do?
Yeah. And I mean, fundamentally, this gets down to, I don't know if how familiar you are with the math wars, but it's kind of
A
this
little
pendulum
bit, but
swing that we have in math education about back to basics versus kind of this inquiry based. And politically, um, we kind of tend to swing back and forth. And so if you've taken the history class, you'll look at some of that. But I mean, I think it's a balance, right? We need procedures, we need basic facts, we need conceptual understanding, we need applications. And so it really is, it's not an either or. And so for your example, solving equations, students need to know enough to estimate and think about, is the answer I'm getting meaningful?
mm,
For me, I think having a visual of solving equation and understanding what it means to keep this balance equal on both sides is much more meaningful than here's a worksheet with 40 equations, go solve them, right? But so how do you give students enough practice that they can understand the math, but also where you're not just drowning in the procedures and now you're thinking about what it actually means to finding the solution to a system of equations or
mm,
whatever it might be, So it's not an either or.
mm,
So I am pro technology, but I'm not technology all the time. It's
mm,
technology when it fits the lesson, when it fits what you're trying to teach.
mm,
I'm pro using AI in meaningful ways when it fits what I'm trying to have students do. If my focus is making sure you can graph an equation, then we might do that by hand. But if my focus is solving a system, or look at what happens when I graph an equation and I change slope and y-intercept, the values of those, then I might use technology so I'm not getting bogged down in the computation. And so it really comes down to, it's a tool, and what is the goal of what I'm trying to teach, and how will whichever tool I choose, whether it's paper, pencil, or Desmos, how will that tool best serve the learning needs of my students?
mm. You've definitely alluded to it already. It's not just is the tool can be neutral, but how I use it is
Yep.
what matters. Am I using it to find patterns? Am I using it to make conceptual connections between different aspects of math? Am I using it in a way to make applications? At least from your perspective, when it comes to the research side of things, does anything kind of bubble to the top when it comes to best practices or non-best practices of using technology?
I mean, I think we definitely alluded to this in the class, and I think it comes down to how you use it. You can actually find research on both sides of the argument. You can find research
Mm,
that says technology has no impact on student learning or maybe a negative impact. You can find research that says it has a positive impact on student learning. I think in general, research says that it has a positive impact on engagement, with students. But when it's used in meaningful, authentic ways, if I just say every day, pull out your calculators and let's just use it graph a bunch of lines, and we're not doing anything with that, that can become tedious, just like doing a worksheet with 40 problems by hand. And so, I mean, I think for me, if I look at the research as a whole, it's really using it as one tool among many. I'm also a
mm,
big proponent of mixed methods. I love group work, but I think group work every single day can get tedious. I love having students go to the board and do work on the board, vertical non-permanent surfaces, but every single day it can get tedious. I think technology is wonderful, but every single day it can get tedious. So it's about having a variety of tools in your little belt of instructional practices and picking the one that's best for the students, the day, what you're trying to teach, and keeping variety in there so that students are getting to engage with math in lots of different ways. So I don't know if that answers your question about what the research says, but I think the research generally says that when it's used in authentic ways, meaning it's a problem that actually necessitates the use of technology. And it's a problem that promotes thinking, critical thinking, and maybe visualization. We talked a lot about the use of technology, especially Desmos or GeoGebra, for providing that visual. When there's a need to use it, I think that's when it's meaningful. If you're just having it there to compute for you and you're not doing anything with that, that's where the research even shows maybe it isn't impactful on student learning.
That's fascinating. Right. Like, here, kid, take a calculator, and you're basically just doing the same thing. How are you using the technology in a different way, in an authentic way? That's really interesting to think about. Now, let's talk about, we've started talking about it a little bit, but I know you said that the AI component, it's relatively new. It was something new that you had added to the course. Yeah. This could yet be another tool that we add to the tool belt in ways that we could use it productively or unproductively. Have you seen, at least so far, have you seen AI really make inroads as far as education in general, or math education, or how do you see the role of AI in all this?
So I see it as another tool. And I think, yeah, I did add it for the first time this past semester because it literally is, hot off the presses. It is coming out and it is changing every day. I think it's interesting, at NAU, last spring, it was, AI came out, ChatGPT came out, and I was like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We got to get a wrangle around this. And honestly, in math, I was kind of like, we've been dealing with this for 10 years. We've had photomath, we've had Wolfram Alpha, we've had these other tools where you can type in a question and get an answer. You can type in a question and get every single step. So as a student, you could just enter every single step and turn in your worksheet and be done. So in math, I didn't find it as groundbreaking as, of course, people in English and history and some of the arts were kind of up in arms because now ChatGPT is going to write our students' papers. It's going to write our students' code. What are we going to do? And I think the same is true with everything. I mean, calculators face the same backlash. Desmos and GeoGebra, there's been some resistance. And so it's a tool. It's one tool among many. And I think for me, it is so out there and on everybody's radar, it's not going away. And so we can either say, don't use it, and the students will use it behind our backs, or we can say it's out there. Let's bring it into the classroom in meaningful ways, not just to bring it in, but how can we use this as another tool in teaching mathematics? Now, having said that, it's interesting because even in 508, we talked about this. When I went digging around to find resources for us to talk about in the class, almost all the resources I found, especially education related, were writing lesson plans, creating problem sets, creating rubrics. So they're phenomenal tools that I think for teachers, because teachers have so much work to do that they give you a place to start. And I think somebody in the class even mentioned that they felt it was like cheating to use ChatGPT. And I don't think it is. I think it's a resource, right? If you want to teach a lesson on polygons, you go search online and you find a lesson, or you go to Teachers Pay Teachers or whatever it might be. Well, if you tell ChatGPT to make me a lesson introducing polygons, it'll spit something out. And then you fix it, you look at it and you read it and you adjust it and you make it fit for your work, right? So it's a tool. Now that I think helps the math teacher, but when I was looking for content-based supports, I don't think we're there yet. I mean, we saw some things with ChatGPT and some of those other sites that we looked at where you can type in, let's say, an equation and it can give you the answer. Some of the sites we looked at that were AI were like tutors, where you might type in your next step and it would come in and give you another step, and then you could do your next step and it might help you. So those are kind of like, tutoring help me buttons like you already see in online My Labs Math or online learning systems for mathematics. So I honestly didn't see a whole lot that would make me think fundamentally differently about teaching math. I think it will come, but I think it still comes down to if we're going to have AI that can do math for us, then how do we use it? And so what do we ask it to do for us? And then how do we bring that in the classroom? Because students will be using this. Our students, when they graduate, this will be out there in their workforce. This will be at their jobs. and they will be expected to know how to negotiate it and how to use it. And so how do we help them understand? If you look at the NCTM standard for technology, it does talk about using technology, but it also talks about teaching students when and how to use it, picking the appropriate tool, and then how to use it appropriately for what you want it to do. And I think that's kind of where we need to be thinking about technology and math. Desmos is great for helping us do some investigations, visualizations, but also how do we help students think about when is this the best tool versus when you should be using a different tool, or if you should be using a tool at all.
Gotcha. You're really making me think. I was definitely one of those students who felt like using AI was cheating. I don't know if I used the word cheating, but it just felt, I don't know why, but it felt different to me than going to Teachers Pay Teachers or going to a website already. But you make a really great point there. I mean, what is the difference between me doing a Google search and finding something and adjusting and adapting it to what I want versus using AI and responding to what AI has given me and using it to adapt? So I guess there really is no difference there. I don't know why, just for some reason that personally just felt a little different to me.
And it does, I can type in this thing and I can get an answer. So it's cheating, but it's a resource. And like anything, whether you get a lesson plan on Teachers Pay Teachers or from Chat GPT, you should, I hope, look at it for accuracy, for what you're trying to do, and then you'll modify it. So it gives you a starting point.
Right. And I think, as with any of these debates, right, they can get taken to the extremes. Like on the one hand, you'll see, I don't know how much you've engaged with Dan Meyer and a lot of his, I think I might have sent you a presentation from him on AI, and it's really funny.
So Dan Meyer and I overlapped at UC Davis. He was a master's student there while I was a PhD student.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. We interacted a little bit. He probably wouldn't remember me or anything like that, but his advisor, Alan Bellman, was my advisor at UC Davis. Yeah.
Yeah, really small world.
That's but yeah, cool. No, you sent me that podcast, and then I love his a lot of his stuff. A lot of his work is really great.
Yeah, it's really interesting as he had that fundamental role and everything that he did with Desmos. And then you'll see a lot. He writes on Substack. I don't know if you're on Substack. It's really interesting kind of new social media I found where you can find different people who are just writing like different newsletters, like journalists, or it could be on any topic that you might want. And he's on there, and right now he's really writing a ton about, he's kind of going after big tech, which is really interesting to think about given his background. And so, because on the one hand, he's kind of responding to the side that's saying, well, AI is going to be the magic fix that's going to finally help every kid understand math, right? Those chat bots, those tutors, these are going to be revolutionary. All of a sudden, all your kids are going to be learning math, right? So that's kind of what he's responding toward. So I think, just any thoughts that you have on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would absolutely fundamentally agree with that. When it comes to what teaching is and what we do as teachers, as much as policymakers and politicians want to create this business model for education, it really is a human endeavor, and it really is about making personal connections. These are tools that we can use to help us in our teaching. I don't think they will ever replace the teacher. I don't think they should. And yeah, I think any of these companies are going to come out and say that their tool is it's the silver bullet that's going to save education. I've been in education long enough to know I've been through probably 10 silver bullets, right, that are the answer for education. But fundamentally, it comes down to the teacher. And again, that's why it's a tool. And really, it's mediated through the teacher deciding, how is this tool going to help my students? And in that, there's so much to the interpersonal relationships and the connections that we make with our students, and having them think and talk and share. So me talking to a chat bot is not the same as me talking to my group mates in a classroom and struggling through a good problem. I can get the answer. I can look at alternative solutions online, all of that, but it's not the same. There's that human element that I think will always be part of what we do as educators.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if you
and
saw.
I mentioned, I guess that's what Dan is kind of railing against.
Yeah, definitely. He's like, this will work for certain kids under certain situations and certain things. And it's like, yeah, I probably would agree with that, but how can I still use it to my advantage? It's a tool, right?
Yeah.
And so I would say one of my last questions here is, we're talking about these different tools that we can use. Teachers are generally, I would say, pretty familiar with Desmos or GeoGebra, especially for geometry. Maybe not as familiar with some of these different AI tools. I mean, are there any AI tools maybe off the bat? I mean, maybe obviously Chat GPT, but as far as any of the ones that you recommended to us, like Magic School, other ones, are there any that kind of floated to the
Um,
top for you?
Gosh, I don't have those off the top of my head, but
Mm-hmm.
Khan Academy, that was another silver bullet, right? Khan Academy
Mm-hmm.
came out with all these videos and they were all you had to do was go watch a video and that would teach you your topic. Well, it's a tool, it's a resource. It does not replace the teacher or a classroom experience, whatever that classroom experience might be. Um, I can't remember a lot of them, and honestly, they change so quickly that probably when I teach this class again, I taught it this past spring, so spring of 26, I will have to relook at all the sites again. Bing is coming out. And then I think it's also going to force the hand of more math related apps. So a lot of these seem to be the ones that we looked at seem to be general AI, and they're like, oh, you can do it with math too.
Mm.
Where I think we're going to start seeing a whole lot more math related because there's a market, right? Everybody wants their child, everybody's looking for that extra leg up to help their student in mathematics. And so I think, again, those are great resources, they're tools, but they are not, I think, what's going to address the issues of equity. We haven't talked a lot about that, but there's certainly access issues in terms
Mm.
of who has access to or not equity. Who has access at home or in their schools, who is being taught how to use these tools in appropriate and effective ways and who's not. So there is a big concern about the technology gap and,
Mm.
who has and does not have access and how that might fall along systemic lines of where we already see inequities in education and increase those gaps further. And so that's a huge thing I think we need to pay attention to as well. So not really answering your question. I can't think of a lot of the sites off the top of my head, but honestly, I just dug around for sites that support mathematics, mathematics teaching, mathematics learning. And there were a couple math related, but really the big ones were kind of these general AI sites that had math uses.
Mm-hmm.
Even Magic School was great, but it was all about teacher resources and supporting the teacher. There was nothing really that was like, here's a great tool for teaching mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And those, I think, where those math action technologies come into play, Desmos and GeoGebra, online virtual manipulatives, things like that.
Mm-hmm. What would you say to the teacher who's heard some of this, who's really interested in using technology, but they might be a little bit hesitant or they're really not sure where to start? What do you think some of the best first steps would be if they wanted to use technology to help their students learn?
I think, as we saw in class, all I did when we were exploring the different tools in class is I went and I found resources that most of these technology tools had already and had you all work through some of them, right? So if you're a teacher and you want to use Desmos and you've heard about it, but you're just not sure where to start, you can go to Desmos or type in learning how to use Desmos and you'll find a bunch of resources. There's lots of videos on YouTube. I would say, honestly, watch enough, read enough that you have a little bit of a skill set, play around with it yourself, but then jump in and do it. I think it didn't happen so much in this class, but in previous iterations of this class, I've had students say like, this is all great, but I'm not going to use it until I know how to do it 100%. And you'll never know how to do it 100%. Every time I teach this, I have to go find what are the new capacities, what are the new capabilities of this program to make sure that we're touching on those. And so be familiar with it enough that you know how you want to use it, and then jump in. Students are not afraid to push buttons. Students are not afraid to try things, and they know how to undo things. I think my generation, at least, is a little bit more hesitant, but we do have that, back arrow button and can undo anything that we do. And especially if you bring them on board and you're like, we're going to try this. I want you to really see how this works. Let's give it a go. They will authentically jump in. It's much better than trying to pretend that you know how to do everything and this is how you do step one and this is how you do step two. That's not really appropriate use in terms of that open-ended exploration. And students, they're willing to jump on board if you're kind of like, let's give it a go and see how it works. So you have to know enough. And we talked about this in class too, that none of our explorations are about the tool themselves. So we explored Desmos, we explored GeoGebra, we explored graphing calculators and spreadsheets. But those are the tools. For me, what I hope people got out of the class fundamentally is how do you shift your mindset and pick appropriate tasks that enable the need for the technology. And then the technology is just the tool, but it's really pedagogically, what am I doing in this task that promotes student inquiry and collaboration and communication? And so that's, I think, what you need to think through as a teacher before you use technology. The tool is just button pushing. So it's more of the, if somebody were wanting to bring technology in their class, really think about how you're going to use it and in what ways and what students should get out of it, and then figure out the tool enough that you can bring it into the classroom.
Oh, that's so good, right? Kind of that big picture, right?
Yeah.
How are they going to be collaborating? How are they going to be figuring out the math? How are they going to be thinking about it? And how can the tool just be a vehicle for their own thinking, right? Because that was one of the hangups that we didn't want, is like, is this tool so complicated, or am I just using it in an aesthetic way and I'm not really using it to promote that deep mathematical thinking that we want?
Yeah.
You know, so
that's a huge shift. But you'll also notice we also looked at many of these sites. They have resources, they have activities, and some are better than others. So you kind of have to make sure you're vetting them. But they kind of give you a way to start thinking about what are some tasks that I can give students that really make them think about and engage in mathematics through the technology.
You know, one of my personal favorites, and I know a lot of teachers like to do it towards the end of the year, is the Desmos art sort of project, where they either create their own or they find a design online and they're able to take the photo and put it into Desmos, and then using all the functions that we learned throughout the year, linear, exponential, quadratic, they can use those and the different transformations to try to make a picture. And it's something that we do as in my Algebra 1 team as we work together. And it really is fun to see the students just try all kinds of different things. And they're, Mr. Beck, how do I make a circle? I'm like, well, that wasn't really one of the functions we learned, but I don't care. I'll show you what the equation of a circle is and where it comes from so that they can start to play with it, you know?
Yeah. And those are those authentic tasks where they're doing so much math behind the scenes. I mean, you could give them a worksheet and say, here's 50 transformations, or they can sit and they can play with the technology and figure out how to make these transformations work and which functions to use. And they've just done as much math as that dry worksheet.
Right. Yeah. And they were like, Mr. Beck, okay, I have my parabola. How do I get it to go sideways? And I said, well, why don't you just try playing with it? You see the general structure here. Well, how could you just change it ever so slightly? Like, what would you do to change the structure? And then playing around with it a bunch. And then they stumbled on the idea, wait, what if I just switch X and Y?
Yeah.
What would happen? And then all of a sudden, like, their minds were just like, what? I have a sideways parabola? That's a thing. I said, that's a thing. That's not our standard, but that's a thing that you can learn. So it's just fun to see how like technology can open that door. I mean, if we wanted to plot all of this by hand, it would just be, be monotonous.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think you and I had a side conversation too. For me, all of this comes down to tasks and finding those tasks that really engage students. And that's the hard part. There's lots and lots of resources out there. You have to dig for them, but how do you pose problems that really draw students in and really make them want to find out that answer? And then in this case, have to use the technology to get there. And so whether we're talking technology or assessment or even, the math reflections class, it all comes down to tasks. If we're going to authentically engage students in inquiry, we have to give them tasks that promote that.
Mm-hmm. A good, rich task.
Yeah.
That's always a challenge, right?
It is.
All the time performing, trying to find and make a task better. How can it fit our goals better? But to me, that's part of the joy of it. I think developing a disposition, right? I think that's kind of the biggest thing, developing this disposition towards it's not about the tool, but how do I use this tool to promote authentic mathematical thinking?
Yeah. And there's always, I always tell my pre-service teachers when I teach the methods class, once you think you have teaching figured out, like you should just stop, because I don't have it figured out, right? Like every year you're always searching and wanting more and different and new. And we should be staying on top of trends in technology and AI and assessment and finding ways to engage and kind of keep pushing ourselves and our students.
Absolutely. Well, Shannon, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Do you have any things that you would like to plug? I'm not sure if your research is public for people to look at if they wanted to, or any maybe NAU sites that they could look at, or is there anything that you would want to just share if people are looking for more information?
Well, I mean, I think you're a phenomenal example of our online MS and Math Ed program. I think it's a phenomenal program. It's asynchronous and fully online, and we have ATA funding through the state to support teachers who want to earn our masters and get DE certified or qualified to teach DE classes. It's just such a joy to work with in-service teachers, and especially somebody like yourself. It's been a joy to have you in class and kind of always questioning and pushing the envelope a little bit, which I really appreciate it. So, I mean, if there's a plug, if people want to learn more, definitely come look into the MS Math Ed or reach out and we'll get you hooked up.
Yeah, second that. I've really enjoyed the program, like especially its flexibility in that, and I really like the summer classes because yeah, it's a little bit more work over a shorter period of time. But I mean, I'm lucky enough that I don't have to have a second job during this time. I know maybe that might not be for everybody, but during this time, I can really dive deep and nerd out about all this stuff, and then and go into these rabbit holes, that I really that I like to. So I just thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I love this conversation.
Yeah, great to see you, Elliot.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, take care.